we're looking at the resurrection, the rebirth, the revitalization of a nation. This doesn't happen too often, and in the history of mankind, there are very, very few examples of this happening. But there is one example of one country, one nation that was diminished, destroyed, its people sent into slavery around the world, dispersed throughout the world, that has regathered itself. It has been reborn. And tonight we're going to be looking at this amazing situation that is represented in the state of Israel. It confirms Bible prophecies. And so we're going to be taking some time tonight to step through a number of Bible prophecies that deal with not only the destruction of the nation, but also its resurrection, its revitalization. According to Wikipedia, modern day Israel is quite an amazing place. Now, you may know things about Israel, you may know nothing about Israel. And as Wayne said in his intro, Israel is always in the news. So I'm sure there's something we all know about Israel. Unfortunately, it's often negative things about Israel that we hear from our news media. However, in its basic laws, Israel defines itself as a Jewish and democratic state and the nation state of the Jewish people. The country has a liberal democracy. It's only one of two in the Middle East, the other being in North Africa, in Tunisia. It has a parliamentary system. It has proportional representation. It has universal suffrage, which means that all classes of people are eligible to vote in government elections. It has a prime minister. The prime minister is head of the parliament called the Knesset. It has a population of around 9 million people. It is a developed country. It's not a third world country. It's not a developing country. It is a developed country. It is a member of the OECD. It is the 33rd largest economy in the world by GDP. And its GDP is $403 billion, or approximately $45,000 per capita. It's a wealthy, prosperous nation. And it ranks among the top countries of the world for standard of living and is the highest for standard of living in the Middle East. It is ranked top in the world for military training, for tertiary education, for research and development, for women's issues such as safety, life expectancy, innovation, and happiness. Tonight, we'll be looking at several prophecies that paint a picture of the state of Israel written thousands of years ago. And what we're going to see from these prophecies is that exactly what we see in the state of Israel today was foretold way back in antiquity. So let's start with a bit of a catchy overview, just to bring us up to speed. As I said earlier, we may have taken our impression of the state of Israel from the news media, which is oftentimes negative. But we'll come up to speed very quickly with a catchy little clip that takes us on a journey very quickly through the history of the Jewish people. Now, this clip was produced in response to President Trump's decision a few years ago to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It was a move that was controversial and electrifying at the same time. Bible students took note of this as a further fulfilling of Bible prophecies. It also caused many people to ask why the US government valued so highly its relationship with Israel. So let's have a quick look at this.
Some claim that Jerusalem
I should also mention the clip may be a little bit jumpy. Okay, so bear with it. If you need, I can give you links to these clips afterwards.
Some claim that Jerusalem is an occupied city. They admit that once upon a time it was the capital city of the Jewish people. But they argue it lost the title some 2,000 years ago, after it was destroyed and its Jewish inhabitants were exiled. And they say, in 1967, the Jews showed up and took Jerusalem from the Palestinian people. So in that case, why does President Donald Trump want to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem? Here is the truth about Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Jerusalem was the capital of the Jewish kingdom established by King David 3,000 years ago. His son, King Solomon, built the first temple in the place where, according to tradition, the binding of Isaac and Abraham took place 1,000 years earlier. The Babylonians destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews, but the Jews quickly returned. 500 years later, the Romans destroyed the second temple. But did that end the Jews' connection to Jerusalem? The answer is a resounding no. In the 2,000 years that followed, empires came and left, conquered, colonized, and occupied Jerusalem, never turning it into their capital. While the Jews, Jerusalem's indigenous people, continued living in and returning to Jerusalem despite the hardship and danger involved. Over 1,000 years ago, the Arab writer Muqaddasi complained that the Jews constitute the majority of Jerusalem's population. Jews remained a majority also in modern times, as documented by the British Council in 1864. And Jerusalem was always the center of Jewish life, even for those living far away in the four corners of the earth. Special fast days and rituals mourn the destruction of the city, and daily prayers express the hope of a full return. In Islam, a religion which was established only 1,400 years ago, Jerusalem was never as holy as Mecca or Medina. In fact, Jerusalem isn't even mentioned in the Quran. Compare that to the 669 times Jerusalem is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Even Muslims on the Temple Mount turn their backs on Jerusalem and face Mecca when they pray. Whether in America, Russia, Iraq, or Iran, the direction of prayer for Jews has always been Jerusalem, the uniting force and the heart and soul of the Jewish people. So what really happened in 1967? First of all, there was no Palestinian entity. In 1948, Jordan conquered the eastern part of Jerusalem, dividing the city and expelling the Jews, destroying their homes, synagogues, and cemeteries. Western Jerusalem was re-established as Israel's capital, while Jordan's capital remained Amman. Then, in 1967, in a war of self-defense, the Jewish state liberated and united its historic capital city. What has happened since then? Israel has returned Jerusalem into a vibrant city and a house of all nations, establishing the freedom of worship to all peoples and religions. So why does President Trump want to move the embassy to Jerusalem? The real question is, why did it take so long?
It's fascinating, isn't it, to consider how history works out. We started our night looking at the words of Jesus in Luke 21. And at that point in history, Israel and Jerusalem were vibrant centers. But we'll be examining what happened, what was said, what unfolded, ultimately how Israel became a forgotten backwater that was squabbled over for centuries, that has turned into a vibrant modern economic miracle in the modern era. whose amazing resurrection out of obscurity confirms Bible prophecy. So let's turn back to our reading for tonight. The prophecies that we're looking at tonight are all observable. They're all understandable. They are written thousands of years before the events they describe happened, but they're clear to see, and they paint a very strong picture of what was to happen to Israel, both in the past and in our present. In my Bible, this little passage of the Bible is entitled "The Destruction of the Temple and the Signs of the End Times." So we now know that we're talking about two events. One that was immediately in the first century, and one that was to take 1900 years to be seen, much closer to our times. Let's have a look at this. We saw in verse 5 that the disciples were talking about how wonderful the temple was. And Jesus says in verse 6 that the time was coming when one stone will not be left upon another. Every one of them will be thrown down. He says, "Teacher," they said in verse 7, "when will these things happen? What will the signs be that they are about to take place?" So he says, "Watch out that you are not deceived." He says, "Many will come in my name, saying, 'I'm he,' and the time is near." Verse 9, "You'll hear of wars and uprisings. Don't be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." And he said to them in verse 10, "Nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be all sorts of natural disasters, etc." In verse 12, however, he says, before all of this, so before all the natural disasters, before all the rumors of wars and all those things happen, he says, they will seize you and persecute you. They will throw you out of the synagogues. They'll throw you into jail. Verse 15, he says, don't worry about any of it. This is all going to happen, but don't worry. You'll be betrayed by your family in verse 16. Verse 17, you'll be very unliked. But Jesus says, verse 18 and 19, stand firm, you'll be okay. Some terrible things were going to befall those people in the first century. Things were going to have a real impact on their lives. But then in verse 20, Jesus says, Jerusalem was about to befall a very calamitous end. When you see, verse 20, Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you'll know that its desolation is near. He says, then escape, take off, get out of the city, go to the country. Verse 22, this is the punishment in fulfillment of what was written. And then he makes the observation in verse 23 and 24 about how terrible those times were going to be. Now, as it turns out, only 30-something years after Jesus spoke these words, in the April of the year AD 70, it was about the time of the Passover, the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem. And since that action coincided with Passover, the Romans allowed pilgrims to enter into the city, but they didn't let any of them out. And strategically, what the Romans were doing was depleting the city of food and water supplies within the walls of Jerusalem. And within the walls, a class of people known as the Zealots, who were a militant anti-Roman party, they were fomenting against the Romans and whipping up factions. And we find that within the city, because of all these factions, they were quite fragmented as a force. They were quite weak, and the resistance wasn't as strong as it could have been. Now, Josephus, a Jewish historian of the time, who himself commanded rebel forces, he attempted to negotiate a settlement with Rome, but because he wasn't trusted by the Romans, the talks ultimately failed. The Romans encircled the city, they cut off all the supplies, and they attempted to starve the inhabitants of Jerusalem out. And by the August, some 5 months later, the Romans had breached the final defenses of the city of Jerusalem. They had massacred much of the remaining population. They also destroyed the temple. And the Western Wall that you see on your screen was the only trace left of that temple, and to this day remains a site of prayer and pilgrimage. The loss of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, is still mourned by Jews today during the fast of Tisha B'Av. However, Rome celebrated the fall of Jerusalem. They celebrated the ultimate conquering of the problematic nation of Judea by erecting a triumphal arch of Titus, which you have on your screen there in the middle of Rome. And as you can see from the picture, they carried out all of the gold and silver of the temple, all of the ornaments, all of the furniture, and they carted it off to Rome. Now, at this point of time, the Jewish people were dispersed. They were chased out of the land of Israel. And what is known as the Jewish diaspora began at this point of time. And it's worth noting that this event was spoken of by the prophet Moses and other prophets. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, we read, "It shall come about that you will be torn from the land where you are entering to possess it." These words were spoken when Israel was only first entering its land thousands of years before the Romans sacked Jerusalem. He says, "Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. There you will serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known." And we see on our map that from Israel, the Jews were scattered and chased into many parts of the world, North Africa, further into the Middle East, and up into the eastern parts of Europe. And between Deuteronomy 28 and Luke 21, we get two very precise prophecies with known dates. In the case of Luke 21, its fulfillment began in the year 70 AD. As we've discussed, Rome was allowed to destroy Jerusalem, destroy the Jewish temple, primarily because they had rejected their Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. The dispersion of the Jews from their homeland was then accelerated after the Second Jewish Revolt. And in the beginning of the 20th century, we have a situation where some 1900 years later, there were only 40,000 Jews left in the land of Israel. Now, for perspective, that is just a few more people than live in the area of Morisset, where I'm zooming from tonight. So not many people at all. The Jewish population of Jerusalem was only 8,000, and all the rest had been scattered through the world, with Jews existing on every continent. No group of people in all of history has been so widely dispersed and then regathered into a uniform collective situation, putting together a government and a vibrant economy. So we have the fulfillment of prophecy here, and we're confirming Bible prophecy through Israel's amazing resurrection. And there we have those numbers up on the screen for us. In 70 AD, some 3 million people inhabited Jerusalem, inhabited Israel. By 1900, only 40,000. But by 2021, we have nearly 9 million people. Now, in Deuteronomy 28, we have a graphic description of exactly what happened to the Jewish people after they were dispersed from their homeland. Everywhere they went, they were harassed. As we read in verse 65 here, among those nations where the Jews will be scattered, they will find no rest. There'll be no resting place for the sole of their foot. But there the Lord will give them a trembling heart, failing of eyes, despair of soul. For your life will hang in doubt before you, and you will be in dread night and day. You'll have no assurance of your life. In the morning you'll say, we wish it was evening. And in the evening you'll say, we wish it was morning. Because of the dread of your heart, which you dread, and for the sight of your eyes, which you will see. Everywhere they went, ladies and gentlemen, they were harassed, they were persecuted, they were targeted. A process that began shortly after the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and stretched right through history for the next nearly 2,000 years. Europeans throughout the Dark Ages and into the modern era persecuting these people, with this persecution climaxing with the Holocaust during World War II, where 6 million Jews were exterminated. All of these persecutions came about, and with it a prophecy that spoke clearly of the desolation of the Jewish homeland. But the prophets make it really clear that despite this dispersion, this desolation of the Jews and their inevitable persecution wherever they go, God would nonetheless preserve them as a nation. You might think, well, how does that happen? They have no central government. They're all over the place. But consider this symbolic prophecy of Isaiah, who wrote 2,700 years ago, 700 years before the birth of Jesus. He wrote in Isaiah 49, but Zion, that is the name for the Jewish people, said, the Lord has forsaken me, the Lord has forgotten me. In verse 15, God responds, can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, but I will not forget you, says God. I will not forget you. Behold, I have inscribed you on the palm of my hand. You know, when you really need to remember something, you get a pen and there's no paper and you jot it down on your hand, and we forever tell our kids, don't write on your hands, but that's where you write it. God says, I have written Israel on the palm of my hands. Elsewhere in Isaiah, he says, don't fear. This is after they've been chased into the rest of the world. I am with you, says God. Don't be anxiously looking about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will uphold you. Behold, all those who are angered at you will be shamed and dishonored. Those who contend with you will be as nothing and will perish. Jeremiah gives us another graphic prophecy. He says, God says, I am with you to save you. For I will destroy completely all the nations where I have scattered you, only I will not destroy you. I will chasten you justly, but will by no means leave you unpunished. And again, in Jeremiah, thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. He says, if this fixed order departs from before me, then the offspring of Israel will also cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth stretched out below, then I will also cast off all the offspring of Israel for all that they have done, declares the Lord. So the question is, and these are very powerful words, when will the Jewish people cease to exist? Now, these words were written 2,800 years ago. Rhetorically, Jeremiah says, well, will they cease to exist when the sun stops coming up in the morning or going down, or the moon coming up at night? Or when the seasons of the year cease to come? Well, the sun's always going to keep rising and the seasons are going to keep rolling. He says, in short, the Jewish people, even though God says, I will scatter them, he says, I will bring them again together, and they are here to stay. So despite their dispersion, despite their persecution, the murderous pogroms that were rolled out through Eastern Europe, leading to the Holocaust, 8.5 to 9 million Jews now live in Israel today, with another 7 million living in other countries around the world. This is an example of Bible prophecy being confirmed. The very fact that Israel has reorganized itself into a nation again confirms Bible prophecies. The Bible talks about the regathering of the Jewish people in some depth. One of the most prolific prophecies in the Hebrew Bible, repeated over and over again. Let's have a look at the words of Isaiah again. He says, it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people. So that those that have been dispersed, he will gather them in with his hand, who will remain. They will come from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the islands of the seas. He, that is God will lift up a standard for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel. He will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Now, this great regathering began nearly 2,600 years after these words were spoken, and nearly 2,000 years after Jesus spoke his words. It was sparked by a man called Theodor Herzl in the 1800s, and he captured the imagination of people all over the world. And at that time, about 40,000 people came back to Israel. The reorganization, however, of Israel, coming together as a collective government with purpose, was spoken of by Ezekiel in a prophecy known as the vision of the dry bones. Let's have a look there. I'll put the text up on the screen. Ezekiel 37, verse 1 to 14. Ezekiel is writing at the time of the first exile into Babylon. And he writes, the hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord, and he set me in the middle of a valley. He's having this vivid vision, set in the middle of a valley full of bones. And he led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? He said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. If we were placed in that situation, we would say it's impossible for those bones to reorganize themselves, for those bodies to come back to life. Utter impossibility. But God said to Ezekiel, prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied, says Ezekiel, as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and the tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said, son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, that is, Israel says, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. They've been saying that for 2,000 years. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. These are powerful words, a powerful prophecy of a resurrection of a dead people brought back to life. We see in this prophecy that the bones spoken of, the house of Israel, the people of Israel, the dryness of the bones is the hope that is gone, that they are cut off, that they have been separated and dispersed from their lands, that the bones come back together. This is the return of the Jews to their land, and God would breathe in them, that God's spirit would inhabit his people, that they would come back to life. No other nation in history has maintained a national exile for 2,000 years and come back to a collective nation. Other nations have been dispersed, have been cut off, have been scattered. But what has happened to Israel is nothing short of extraordinary. What is also extraordinary is that it was foretold in the Bible 2,800 years before it took place. The gradual returning of the Jews, as we saw from the late 1800s with Theodore Herzl, became an overwhelming surge at the end of the 1940s, after World War II and the horrors that the Jews endured. Once again, we have a precise prophecy with a precise fulfillment. We have Israel's amazing resurrection confirmed by the Bible. And in keeping with that stark imagery of Ezekiel, we have the words of Mark Twain in 1866 when he toured there. He said in his diary, it is a blistering, naked, treeless land. Of all the lands that are for dismal scenery, I think, he said, Palestine must be the prince. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. He said, Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. It is desolate and unlovely. But what we have are contrasts of what they were, what happened to them in AD 70, and what they have become. And thanks to people like Mark Twain, we have a snapshot of what it was like before Israel was reborn. It wasn't until they declared the re-establishment of their state in 1948 that they were able to reconquer city of Jerusalem in the War of Independence that followed. Jeremiah emphasizes this fulfillment in a very startling statement. In Jeremiah 16, he says, "Therefore, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord. And it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel out of the land of Israel, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north and from the land of the countries where he had banished them. I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers." This is an incredible statement. Jeremiah is saying that there is a day that was coming in the future for Jeremiah, but in our present era, a day that was coming, Jewish people would be able to look back on their history and conclude that the greatest miracle of their history was their regathering from the four corners of the earth. A miracle that is greater, says Jeremiah, than their deliverance from slavery in Egypt. The Bible prophecies make it plain that the day would come when the city would be theirs. The city of Jerusalem would also be theirs. The prophet Zechariah spoke of this when he said, "The Lord has spoken," he says, "that old men and old women will again sit in the streets of Jerusalem." These are old Jewish men and old Jewish women, each man with his staff in his hand because of age. The streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there. The Lord of hosts says, "Behold, I am going to save my people from the land of the east and the land of the west. And I will bring them back, and they will live in the midst of Jerusalem. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God in truth and righteousness." Now, these words were spoken 500 years before the time of Jesus. They were written after the Jewish people returned from the first exile in Babylon and had resettled themselves in Jerusalem. This prophecy is looking forward to the next destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And so this is a prophecy about a future resettlement after the next destruction, after the destruction of the Romans. And that future resettlement of the city of Jerusalem has happened in our times. In 1967, the Israeli forces regained the city of Jerusalem for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. And it's no wonder that on that day that the chief rabbi of the Israeli army, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, came to the Western Wall, blew a shofar and proclaimed, "We have taken the city of God. We are entering the Messianic era." That is the era of the Messiah for the Jewish people. He said that because he knew that the prophecies say that when the Jews are back in their land and in their city, the Messiah will come. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we have precise prophecies being precisely fulfilled. So what do we do with this evidence of Israel's amazing resurrection? Do we dismiss it as coincidence? Or do we recognize it for what it is? That it is positive proof that not only God exists, but he has supernatural knowledge of the future, that he has wisdom to accurately foretell the future, that he has the power to see that what he has proclaimed about the future actually comes true. Israel's amazing resurrection confirms Bible prophecy. And that brings us to the modern era. As we've already seen, the desolate land becomes fertile, the dispersed people would return, the dry bones are revitalized and brought back to life. And all of this was also spoken of by Jesus himself in Luke 21, verse 29, the parable of the fig tree. Let's have a quick look at that. Throughout the Bible, various trees are used to describe different aspects of the nation of Israel. For example, the vine is a symbol of Israel's spiritual privileges. The olive tree is a symbol of Israel's religious privileges. And the fig tree is a symbol of Israel's national privileges. So let's have a look here in Luke 21, verse 29. Jesus told his disciples a parable. He said, look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Now, the Bible here, Jesus here is comparing the fortunes of Israel to good, sweet figs, the first of the summer figs. And we know that we're talking about Israel because it's used several times. This imagery is used several times in the Bible. For example, one example is from Hosea chapter 9, where he talks about the ancestors of Israel, the fathers of Israel, the patriarchs. He says, when I saw your ancestors, it was like seeing the early fruit on the fig tree. They were like the first fruits of the summer crop, first, the best that the nation had. These figs contrast with green, inedible figs. In Matthew 24, we see Jesus use the imagery of figs. He says, learn the lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see that these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. And he's talking about the same things as he is in Luke 21, the destruction of Jerusalem, the persecution of the people, their dispersion through the land, through the world, rather. The process of leafing and fruiting is symbolic of Israel's restoration to its national birthright, to a display of their God-given prestige and status. And that is what we've seen in the late 19th and through the 20th centuries, starting in the late 1800s, gaining momentum around about 80 years ago, the nation of Israel being reborn, the Jews coming back from around the world, pouring into it. Ezekiel 36 tells us, I will take you from the nations, gather you from all the lands and bring you into your own land. Thus says the Lord God, I will cause the cities to be inhabited and the waste places to be rebuilt. Remember Mark Twain's description of the land, a horrible, desolate place. The desolate land will be cultivated instead of being a desolation in the sight of everyone who passes by. They will say, the desolate land has become like the Garden of Eden. And the waste, desolate and ruined cities are fortified and inhabited. God promised that Israel would not only come back to the land, but that they would reinvigorate the land, turn it into a Garden of Eden from a wasteland. And that is exactly what has happened. Trees have been planted, water has been channeled, and agriculture has sprung up throughout that arid region. The result was that by the 1950s, every crop imaginable was growing in Israel. During the 20th century, by the mid-20th century, there were some 250 million trees planted throughout the area of Israel. A remarkable feat of engineering and logistics, but a testimony to the organization of government and a testimony to Bible prophecy and the determination of God to restore Israel as foretold. Let's go back. Israel is now one of the most vibrant liberal democracies on earth, with one of the most vibrant economies on the planet, described by many as a nothing short of an economic miracle. Israel's resurrection from its destruction in AD 70 through 2,000 years of dispersion is nothing short of amazing. What we're going to see now is a short clip that really highlights just how amazing Israel is. There are more startup companies in Israel than anywhere else on earth. The economic prowess of the nation of Israel is unparalleled for its size and for its age. So what do we do with this information? As we asked before, do we dismiss it as coincidence, or do we recognize that this is proof that God has a plan and purpose for the earth, that the prophecies that were foretold about the state of Israel being reborn and brought back to life are true? We can have confidence in the Bible and we can have confidence in God. Let's have a look at this clip.
I want to recommend a book. This one is called Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle.
Startup Nation.
Startup Nation.
Startup Nation.
Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle.
What's behind this amazing story?
This was a huge story about innovation, about changing the world that wasn't being told, that needed to be told.
Startup Nation is probably the most important book written about Israel.
Israel is the fastest growing, one of the most dynamic, entrepreneurial, and innovation-based economies on the planet.
Every year it produces more startup companies than China, Japan, India, and the United Kingdom.
How did Israel pull this off? In the least likely of places, surrounded by adversaries, in a state of war since its founding, no access to natural resources, completely shut out from the region because of the Arab League boycott, no access to regional capital, no access to regional markets, with a tiny domestic market of its own. How did they pull this off?
We think of as innovation as mainly about ideas, but it's really not, because there are a lot of countries with a lot of great ideas with as many patents as Israel has, and yet they don't have nearly as many startups.
What's amazing about Israel is not just the startups in this little startup nation, but the fact that we have large companies of scale who are leading in these clean technologies.
And we figured out that there are two other big ingredients that go into startups, and one is a lot of drive and determination, and the other is a willingness to take risks.
When you look at the NASDAQ, companies are listed from around the world. There's one country, though, that truly stands out, and that is Israel.
It's a cauldron of creativity and creative energy, and of really dynamic, really interesting, really diverse group of people solving really big problems in the world. Problems in the world that, if they can be solved, will truly make the world a better place.
Google, eBay, Intel, Cisco, the CEOs of these companies say at 25 years old, the average Israeli has far more leadership and entrepreneurial experience than their peers anywhere else in the world.
Israel really is a whole country of Silicon Valley.
Startup Nation is about how that creative energy went into one sector, into tech. But that same creative energy goes into social startups, amazing social startups in Israel, into the arts and culture. It makes sense that creative energy comes out in many different forms.
This book that takes Israel beyond the conflict and shows the real Israel.
What's exciting about this whole story is that whatever you're into in your community, whether it's your university, your hospital, your business, or whatever, you know that there's something going on in Israel that's very creative, that would be perfect to work together, to join forces. And this is kind of, I think, a new paradigm for working with Israel.
Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the words of Isaiah. I am God, there is no other like me. I am God, declaring the end from the beginning. From ancient times, things which have not been done, saying my purpose will be established. I will accomplish all my good pleasure. Calling the bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I've spoken, truly I'll bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it. I'm sure you'll agree with me that Israel's amazing resurrection confirms Bible prophecy. Thank you for your attention.